Hi everyone, and welcome to the final day of COP26 and ClimaTalk's last live stream discussion. Today we're going to be focusing on the developments and disappointments surrounding the built environment, and also later in the session we will be taking views from some of our trackers on the takeaways from COP26. I'm Amy Wilson, I'm the COP26 team lead at ClimaTalk, and I'm joined here as well today by Kat, who is my events coordinator for the COP26 team. Hi Kat. We're both from ClimaTalk, and ClimaTalk is a youth-led non-profit organisation that aims to demystify climate policy and amplify young people's voices in the fight against climate crisis. We are also joined today by Keziah, our in-house tracker, who is in Glasgow at the minute and has been at the Green Zone yesterday at COP26. Keziah has been tracking the built environment, and we're really looking forward to hearing her views on some of the progress achieved at COP26. The first 20 minutes, we're going to be talking about the built environment, and then we will move on to some of the takeaways for COP26. I'll hand over to you, Kat.
Yeah, absolutely. So as Amy said, thank you so much for being with us today, Keziah. We're so excited to chat a bit more about the built environment. So to kind of kick off that discussion, Keziah, could you explain for us why it is important that we are discussing the built environment at all in negotiations on the climate crisis?
Yeah, of course. So the built environment currently accounts for about 40% of the global energy emissions worldwide. And within that, construction materials account for about 10% of emissions. And the two, I think like what I've realized, the two main issues around the built environment is this like twin problem of growing urbanization. So the need to build more and more houses, whereas like whilst also trying to retrofit houses to make them more energy efficient. And so it's kind of led into this like two-way split between thinking about how we retrofit houses and like how they operate, and then also the embodied carbon, so the construction process. So like carbon being the carbon emissions in both those like life that forms like the total life cycle of the building.
And I think when we discuss those things like locked in carbon, so concrete and cement are a huge part of those discussions, and how do we move those away from such carbon intensive processes, but also retrofitting, like we have, especially in the UK and I'm sure in many other countries, a lot of stock that is incredibly hard to retrofit and bring up to energy standards that would reduce that energy consumption. So taking that into mind, what measures were taken at COP26 and how did they discuss improving the existing housing stock to bring it up to that appropriate level of EPC rating?
Yeah, so a lot of the measures taken were to do with these whole life cycle roadmaps, which is like joining together embodied and operational carbon, but I think I'll talk about those a little bit later. The time being, some really cool examples that I saw yesterday just being at COP was discussions around heating. So that was like the management of heating, and also the provision of heating. So the cost of a heat pump now costs about, in the UK, about £5,000. So they need to bring that, they're trying to bring that price down. Also discussing different types of heating, like district heating, community heating, or putting green hydrogen through existing pipelines. There was also, to do with the management of heating, there were these really cool things called digital twins, where like companies have basically developed, they did one for the buildings where COP was taking place, which is basically just exactly the same in real time. It's exactly the same, it's just a virtual model of the building, but it shows on each different level all the carbon being emitted, like all the sources of energy, how much carbon is being emitted, and then they record like so there's sensors in the building recording in real time like the people going in and out and how much carbon or how much energy is being used, and then that allows them to manage it, and then it also allows them to do this thing where they implement, if they're trying to think, oh, if we do this, trying to do an experiment to see if it will reduce energy, then they'll do it on the digital twin first, and then that way they can see what the outcome would be like in the digital model, and that will then kind of de-risk it for private investment, because they can see what the outcome is before actually trying it.
That's really interesting, and also always a good strategy or a good tool if it means that there's going to be more private investment in energy preserving technologies. So really cool that you got to see that firsthand for us, Keziah.
Yeah, there was also this just quickly, there was one of the guys said to me that like the actual buildings where the green zone, blue zone were taking place, is they actually didn't do much to reduce carbon emissions, but they produced these feasibility studies, so these digital twins of how they could reduce carbon by 100%, and like mainly was by adding solar panels to the roofs, or just by like introducing a management that meant like all the lights were turned off when there was no one in the rooms, and already that would get it down by about 50%, but they didn't actually implement this. So yeah, it's kind of, we're like yet to see if these digital twins would be put to any use.
Yeah, absolutely. They are tools, but not actual mitigation tactics unless those tools are used and implemented effectively. But again, those are quite stark differences in how effective the kind of reduction of energy use in the buildings would be. So hopefully the digital twins do prompt people to see that there are major changes with buildings that can be made to make them greener. And that potentially those adaptations, I mean, to me, a non-building expert, don't sound that intensive, that sort of financially intensive. So hopefully those kind of fixes can be implemented more widely if digital twins show that they have the efficacy behind them. So kind of moving on a little bit to what you mentioned just now, and indeed what you wanted to highlight in your second bullet point on the slide here. I mean, to all of us who have no idea what is a whole life cycle roadmap, and how will those help us build climate resilient buildings?
So the whole life cycle roadmap is trying to bring together the embodied and operational carbon. So there's a lot of focus on operational carbon emissions, which is like how much carbon the building's emitting whilst it's in use. And then the embodied carbon is just about like the making and the construction process, and that often gets overlooked when they're calculating like the carbon emissions of a building. And so the UK, for instance, yesterday launched its net zero whole life cycle carbon roadmap by 2050, and that is trying to reduce carbon emissions at each step, both operational and embodied. Then there were some other really important announcements of these roadmaps. There was the World Green Building Council, which that was more like a signatory, buildings, like a lot of countries and organizations, cities coming together and signing that they're going to try and reduce their operational body carbon by 2030. But again, that's just a promise. There was the global cement and concrete emission, which was the biggest commitment within its industry, that made a roadmap for net zero by 2050. And then also on this side of the engineers and the architects, Arup, which is like a leading firm in that area with clients, I think, over around 140 countries, they also committed to whole life cycle carbon roadmaps by because last year they committed to zero emissions by 2030, but I'm not sure that was realistic, so I think they revised it, and now they've committed to life cycle carbon assessments for all its building projects, new and retrofit, from next year.
That all sounds like really good progress, especially in the cement and concrete, which I know accounts for not only a large amount of carbon emissions, but also a vast amount of water use in its formulation. Was there any sort of methods for how they would improve?
Yeah, so it was all about trying to marry the climate science. So because trying to create buildings for a future environment obviously is kind of counterproductive, or no, not counterproductive, but it's different to how we created building codes in the past, because usually it's based on past evidence. But now kind of with climate science predicting all these future weather events and like unforeseen climate scenarios, then you need to create building codes for future events. And then so they're like trying to marry the construction process with the climate science to create these new building codes.
Yeah. Absolutely. So then kind of how all of this gets implemented on a macro scale and indeed a micro scale, I guess, leads quite neatly on to kind of your third point about finding the finance, where the money is coming from. So we have ideas about how to mitigate buildings to make them more climate resilient, to make them lower carbon, lower energy intensive. But what did the COP26 discussions yesterday, if at all, say about where the money's coming from, and more broadly, where is the finance coming from in that area?
Yeah, so everyone I spoke to was like talking about how like the massive financing gap, but then saying that private finance isn't actually hard to come by. It's not like the money's there for investment. It's about de-risking. So that's where like the stuff like the digital twins come in really useful. But then also about engaging consumer, like creating consumer demand. So it's like a lot of banks say they'll get on board once there's like a higher consumer demand. In terms of like in the UK, I think the biggest kind of block towards kind of retrofitting houses is just like where's the money coming from? And so it's like trying to I think the government's trying to introduce tools to incentivize consumers and banks. So like examples would be kind of green mortgages, or home energy saving tools, which allows customers to calculate the efficiency of their own homes. Like thermal imaging of properties. Oh, and then another important one is kind of the national scheme, which is this EPC rating, which shows the energy efficiency of homes per year. And all homes across the UK are going to be rated on their EPC rating. And then from A to G, with A being the highest and homes C upwards being counted as energy efficient. And then that eventually will become tied into mortgage ratings, which will hopefully make that reduce the mortgages on efficient homes.
I think to add on to that, an interesting report that I saw by Savills yesterday was how much money it's going to cost to move up those EPC ratings. So, for some homes moving up to the EPCC, it's going to cost 20 odd £1,000 to get there. So I think as much as it's creating the demand, it's also about, incentives and how can we mobilize the finance and the incentives to ensure that people can make those moves up to higher EPC ratings, because £20,000 is quite a lot to, spend straight away. So and all the small tools that can help to determine which changes to make straight away, or some to, which ones will have the biggest impact on a housing energy efficiency is really important. To touch on that, Keziah, I don't know if there was anything yesterday on insulation and sort of like the transition from single glaze to double glaze windows, because obviously these are two big parts of a housing stock that can change, and whether there was any talk on those aspects.
I have to admit, I didn't see any talk on those aspects. I heard a lot of talk about kind of passive house, which was like trying to create these new insulated houses. And then there are some really cool experiments happening in Glasgow. One was this on Nidri Road, this architect John Gilbert basically trying to, because there's no inhabitants in this massive apartment block, and there's a lot of apartment blocks like this around Glasgow, and it's going to undertake a full renovation and retrofit to insulate the house. And if that works, that will become a blueprint or an example that the Scottish government can use.
And do you know why that was different, or any innovation that they're doing in that space?
I think it was like one of the case studies that's been commissioned and financed by the Scottish government. And so a lot of these case studies happening that there was like in the Green Zone, there's a lot of examples of case studies in different areas happening around Scotland. And I think they're really important because they're innovative and some of the first of their kind. And then if they're successful and cost efficient, then they can be upscaled.
Yeah.
So I guess we've talked about energy quite a lot there. Is there anything else that you think might be valuable for our viewers to know on the built environment and consideration of like green cities?
Yeah, another big thing was like with all these designing of this opportunity.
Oh, I think we might have
especially
just
after COVID, important thing.
Oh, we lost you just for a second. Could you restart your answer? Because I think we lost your introduction to that there.
Sure. Yeah. Just I think thinking about this opportunity to redesign our cities. Mm-hmm. In one of the talks yesterday, there was I think someone from the Asian Development Bank talking about some of the new housing projects they've been financing and thinking about accessibility in the construction of new cities. And so like whether that's in transport or in housing or even just in kind of creating these new like 20 minute compact cities where everything's close together, making it easier for people with accessibility issues to navigate around the city. So making more inclusive urban environments.
And I think that ties in with an amendment that was made to the 100% zero emission transport document yesterday, that the latter paragraphs include a mention to active travel and public transport and the awareness of behavioural change and moving away from dependency on transport systems such as cars. So I think that nicely ties in and thinking about, how do we make everything a lot closer for people to get access to, so they're using less resources to get from A to B. I guess that's hard in a modern world where we are commuting quite a lot to work, but I guess that's a factor to consider of, and I guess with COVID as well, like working from home and those considerations, whether that will stay true for the future.
I think also like with working from home, there like an important thing is thinking about if we're spending more time indoors, what and with how we want our buildings to kind of affect our well-being and designing according to increased time indoors. For instance, like I heard in Dubai that like you spend 90% of your time living indoors, and so constructing these new cities, you need to think about improving our health and well-being through architecture. And then I think just lastly, there was the World GBC would publish this report beyond the business case, why we can't afford to not invest in sustainable buildings. And an important finding was just that the demand for kind of well-being and social benefits in housing is just going to increase exponentially. And so investors need to think about how they're going to integrate that into their architecture.
And I guess one question to like clarify, what do we mean by a sustainable building? I don't know. Keziah's Fraser.
Wait, Keziah, can you still hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh, Amy, do you want to shoot question again?
Yeah, sorry, I think you might have just phrased this. So what do we mean by a sustainable building in this context?
Yeah, exactly. So a sustainable building is not only one that can adapt to future weather events, but also that can adapt to changes in our lifestyle and life patterns and ages. So on the one hand, thinking the future weather events and kind of tying those two together.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Keziah, just before we round up then, do you think we've missed anything? Is there anything else you want to flag or highlight before we round up that discussion, or do you feel that you've kind of got across what you saw in the Green Zone yesterday and heard there?
I think the only thing is just in terms of just in the UK, thinking about who's going to bear the brunt of all this retrofitting, or like when we think about where the finance is going to come to make these green upgrades to homes. Obviously, like you're saying, it's really expensive, and I'm just a bit skeptical where they're going to find the money for that and who's going to have to pay for that, especially if they start charging more on houses that aren't energy efficient. Yeah, because it can't really be on the as much as they've been saying all these new tools for the consumer or consumer demand, it can't really, can't put the weight on the consumer to fund it.
Yeah, definitely. And there's also kind of inequities in terms of responsibility between, obviously, the landlord and renter market in the UK is enormous, not as huge as it is in other European countries, but certainly the onus there is surely on the landlord to ensure that the retrofitting has gotten through, but absent landlords are a sort of also chronic issue in the UK who don't sort of implement those kind of measures. So if we are relying on individual initiative, even if you make it slightly more financially desirable by making mortgages more desirable, if you sort of upgrade through the ranks, as I say, if you're relying on individual initiative and individual ability to pay, that's not really going to deliver the kind of retrofitting that we need and the kind of changes to the built environment that we need quickly enough.
Yeah, exactly. I think because it's so quick, like so many of the new roadmaps are trying to project change in like the next 5-8 years, then what are customers just going to suddenly see, like the price of their like mortgages go up, or how it's not really room for gradual change.
Yeah, and indeed, like gradual change is kind of, in the UK at least, you know, of course buildings can go up hugely quickly. I'm always astonished by how quickly buildings can be built, but certainly like the built landscape that we live with is very similar to the built landscape, you know, decades ago. It's in order to kind of generate a mass change in like building regulation or like the way our walls are or our insulation. It needs a more, from the sounds of what you're saying, it sounds like it needs a kind of more targeted campaign than we're currently seeing, because that's a huge amount that needs changing. And I've seen myself, obviously the Built Environment Day was only yesterday, but very little by way of an actual targeted campaign to ensure that those changes are made and made financially viable for people. I think Keziah is frozen again.
Yeah, sadly. Obviously, the wider Glasgow network is affected somewhat by
at the moment,
back up. Well, I think we will round up the built environment. Oh, I think she might be coming back. No. I think we'll round up the built environment discussion there. Thank you, Keziah, very much for joining us today, and enjoy your afternoon in Glasgow. And we look forward to hearing some of your further thoughts on our Instagram later. So thank you very much for joining, Keziah.
Thank you.
So we're now going to move on to the key takeaways from COP26. We're hoping to be joined by Jack and Charlie at COP26 currently, who are listening in to the presidency conversation that is happening right now, to hear some of the progress or stopping points or barriers that are in trying to deal with at the minute in terms of getting an agreement out of COP26. But I guess we will start, Kat. So what would be your first major takeaway from COP26?
Yeah, thank you. And I'm very excited for them to join us after attending that presidency event very soon. I think those negotiations will be going on for some time. I don't think we'll be able to give you a kind of definitive answer just yet. But yeah, very much looking forward to hearing from them. Oh, indeed, I think they have just joined the waiting room. So I'll let them in for the moment while I give my first key takeaway. And I think having, moderated quite a few of these live discussions, having looked at kind of second week developments, first week developments, through ClimaTalk and, through my own reading, I've been very, hi guys. I've been very struck by the absence of discussions around transparency, and also the fact that, the commitments at COP26 also mean very little without transparency. Those commitments themselves are already insufficient in terms of achieving 1.5 degrees. But even those insufficient commitments have very little. Also, my windows are currently being cleaned. I don't know if there is background noise. I really hope there isn't. Those already insufficient commitments can't be achieved without sufficient delivery plans. There aren't delivery plans in place, and yet, us as members of civil society, think tanks, pressure groups have quite little ability to put pressure on governments to show that they are going through with the apparent pledges. Because we don't have transparency on what they're doing. We don't have open discussions about how far governments have gotten in actually delivering these very broad goals. Because, net zero by 2050 means very little unless you actually have steps to achieve that in the next few years. And I think part of the problem with transparency, which, as I say, I've seen kind of underpinning almost every live discussion we've done, is that there isn't really an incentive for governments to pursue greater transparency. There's very little incentive for delegations at COP26 to kind of talk about the fact that they aren't delivering on their NDCs. There's very little incentive to be open about the fact that they aren't delivering on what they're saying they're delivering. And so it doesn't get spoken about. There wasn't, despite the fact that transparency should and indeed does underpin all of the topics we've talked about at COP26, there is no day dedicated to it. There's no specific events dedicated to it by the COP26 presidency. And so I think for me, that's been the kind of underlying deficiency in a lot of the discussions. Also really nice to see you joining us, Jack and Charlie. Thank you for hopping on the call.
Yeah, from a very, very dark room is where they are currently at COP26. Not quite sure where you are, but do you want to maybe build on that and kind of talk about your experiences of what you've seen at COP26 over the last 2 weeks?
Yeah, I think before we go into our takeaways, it'd be quite interesting to talk about where we just were, which was at an event called the People's Plenary, where basically it was, so the UN has 9 observer constituencies, and we're accredited through Youngo, which is the youth constituency, but there are other ones for farmers, research, Indigenous peoples, and some other groups. And it was probably by far the most powerful event that we've witnessed at COP. I think we've said on some of our live streams before that where we've gone to events outside of COP where there might be people from the global south or Indigenous people speaking more freely than they can speak here. And they're like, when you're listening to someone just speak from the heart about, this global issue that they're facing, about how it's impacting their community and, their lives, and it's the impact it's having on them, and they don't need a speech to talk about it. And it's very emotional. And I think, seeing people like Indigenous people from the global south there talking about their experiences, it's the first time I've seen that happen inside COP. And it was so powerful. And there was one point where there was a young Indigenous person speaking, and just an amazing orator, really, really powerful speech about the genocide of her people in Canada and who's responsible for the government and how they will survive it. And at the end, everyone just stood up and was just clapping. And it's the first time I've seen someone get a standing ovation inside COP. Like the passion and emotion in that room, it was amazing. And we were just saying that if every meeting at COP, if every event was like that, it would be climate change fixed. Like there was so much energy to take action. It was brilliant.
Yeah, just building on that and kind of turning those feelings, which I had as well, into sort of concrete reflections about COP. I think that one of the reasons that it is so powerful is that there was incredible representation across ages, across where people were from, genders. There was sort of a disabled constituency which was allowed to speak for the first time ever at COP. And I think it sort of speaks to, and I guess the type of things that people were speaking about at this event were a lot of the climate solutions that we've talked about through the 2 weeks that are missing from the discussions when ministers are getting up and speaking. And it's not by coincidence that the most inclusive event at COP is one that's speaking about the solutions that have been sorely missing in the ongoing discussions which are happening right now. So I think that there's a clear link there, which is a big takeaway from COP, is that is a direct reflection of the power of inclusion and the necessity for inclusion, not just that it's a nice thing to have, but it's necessary if we are to achieve the climate solutions that are necessary, and certainly to achieve any form of climate justice.
I guess the real shame of that is we're on the final day. Why did that not happen on day one? Why has that not been seen throughout? And I think Jack, that iterates the points that we've spoken about at length over the last 2 weeks, that it hasn't been an inclusive COP at times, and people have been missing from key debates and key negotiations. Maybe you can expand on that a little bit more about what you've seen throughout the 2 weeks, or what has been lacking, in your opinion.
Yeah, I think something, again, picking up from what we just witnessed, was the speaker for Ringo, who are the observer group, the constituency that are sort of monitoring the process of COP. So trying to understand, they don't have sort of agenda like some of the other constituencies do, but their focus is to be impartial and monitor the process of COP and make an assessment based on that. And she provided some really interesting points about how Alex Sharma has said multiple times that this is the most inclusive COP ever. And that statement is made based on the fact that many more people were allowed to attend this COP than ever. Many more press badges were given out. Many more civil society groups were allowed to attend. However, that doesn't really equate to inclusivity if the venue is not set up to accommodate that increased number of people. And that's not been done in any way. And in fact, what it's done is lead to the decrease in inclusivity, because people sure have been allowed to come into the blue zone, not to mention all the issues with people who weren't even able to come to this space, but more people than ever have been allowed into the blue zone, but that's not translated. It's actually translated into less people being allowed into negotiations, to engage with politicians, to engage with the negotiators who have a seat at the table. So effectively what's happened, and she was presenting this from a very objective perspective, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but she was sort of talking about the percentage increase in people from press to civil society to party delegations themselves have swelled up in numbers. But what that has translated to is quite a dysfunctional COP inside, because there's too many people, and to control that huge number of people, they've effectively shut people out from the main places of decision making, the main places of power. And that is what we're speaking about, I think, when we talk about inclusivity, and how this event that we were just at is different, as people were allowed to have a voice, which has not happened throughout the 2 weeks. And I think what Amy says is absolutely right. It's unfortunate that it comes on the very last day at the 9th hour, while the negotiators were literally actually sitting in the plenary room across from us and could have heard the clapping and the chanting and whatnot. But these are voices that they needed to hear throughout the 2 weeks, not on the last day when they're effectively tweaking this, the current iteration of the draft document. And really what's happening to the draft document is they're whittling it down to like decreasing the ambition to try to get countries to sign on to this. And so it was a weird sort of juxtaposition between what was happening in the room that we were, and the room that was literally right next door, where ministers were meeting and discussing the most recent update of the draft.
There's almost too much. I mean, obviously, COP itself is, by its very name, a conference of parties signed up to the UNFCCC, but there's almost too much, from the sounds of it, too much onus placed on the negotiations among government ministers, and sort of like excluding that negotiations among government ministers from the voices that we've often spoken to through these live discussions, and who we've like followed online. I'm sure that you've met in person, and it's so frustrating. It's so frustrating to hear about, let alone to sort of see, let alone to be one of the people whose voices needs to be heard in the negotiation room and isn't. Because it's something that I thought when Greta Thunberg was sort of talking about COP26 and saying, it's all blah, 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 it's all the same stuff again from government ministers. And she's not wrong in terms of this sort of insular nature of government negotiations. I mean, it's difficult now to see the drafts coming through. And Jack and Charlie, we're keen to hear your explanation on that in a moment. But as you say, essentially dulling it down, softening commitments, so more people will sign on to what is a sort of inept agreement. But that's so frustrating to see when we also know at COP there are, organizations, Indigenous communities, Indigenous peoples, not as many as there should be, but who are trying to be there to make a change. And some of them are on the ground there, not enough of them are. And even when they're on the ground at COP26, they're not getting heard, or certainly aren't getting heard in the, meaningful, concrete legislative capacity, which at this stage in the climate crisis we need. It was never sufficient to just allow people to be on the ground, but even more so now, it's sort of where, as you say, we're at kind of such a point in the climate crisis where these people need to be at the heart of negotiations, not kind of on the outside.
And I guess, Charlie, I know something that we've spoken about as well is Indigenous peoples. Maybe you can speak a little bit more about where you see the future going, looking to COP27, and how we can do better than we have done this time around.
Yeah, I think that's one of my main takeaways from this COP has been the value of Indigenous knowledges to the conversations that we're having in here. And I think especially, from today, but mainly from attending People Summit events during the past week where, Indigenous people have been able to have a voice, have been able to control the conversation. It's just been so interesting to hear. And I think the main reason it's so valuable is because, as we've said a few times, what you need is really radical system change. And it's hard to do that when you are someone who is grown up in the system, you're so indoctrinated in the system. It's so valuable to have a perspective from outside that is sort of telling you that something else is possible, other ways of living are possible, outside of, capitalism. And and I think the value of those Indigenous voices that we need to be getting into COP27 is it takes so many forms. I mean, if you take, for example, the value in explaining the historical origins of this crisis, when you listen to Indigenous people talk, you very easily see how the threads of, colonization, militarization, patriarchy, racism, all tie so in with the climate crisis, because they're at the intersection of all these oppressions. And you really just need to sort of listen to their stories. We're hearing people from all over the world talk about, how they're experiencing the climate crisis, but talk about it in such a way that they're really explaining how these different things come together. And it really just exposes the whole system that as opposed to when you're in here and you're kind of just, it's all piecemeal, trying to fix little bits, trying to, a bit more carbon offsetting, trying to get net zero a bit quicker. And it's not really the radical solutions that you really need. So, I think it's like we've said, I mean, I guess I'm repeating, but it's just so valuable that we need to get those voices more in. And I think you just hope that they learn from the lessons, the mistakes that have been made here, so that, more people from Indigenous backgrounds of the Global South are able to get to Cairo, that when they host it there, they're able to, get people involved in negotiations. Those people have a platform, that they don't have to run events outside, that people have to leave the venue to go and attend, that they should be here. There should be events where they can say how they're what they're experiencing, what their stories are, because these are really people that are on the front line of the crisis. They're telling us what it is like, for communities around the world who are really, really on the front line. So it's powerful stuff, and there's a lot of room for improvement.
And I think that ties in with some of my frustrations at the end of COP25 after I attended there in Madrid. And you go to a lot of the pavilion events and side events, and you hear some great insights into how we can do things better. Some of the ones that really ring true for me were the inclusions of oceans and water in climate discussions, or public health. These are often sideline topics that aren't brought into the big negotiation halls and considered. And I think, we've got to do better at bringing some of these topics into the climate discussion. I know when we did our preparation for COP26, we highlighted a lot of topics that we thought would be on the presidency topic list, and they just weren't. And I think obviously there's only so many topics they could feature in a day, but I think it would be quite nice to have subtopics or spaces for people to talk about all the experiences and learnings that they have, and bring those through in the blue zone, and not just leave them in the green zone or external events. That the COP, I definitely agree.
Oh, sorry, and just to build on what you're saying, that just reminded me of something else. That it's so interesting that the vantage point that COP takes, and you see so here, like in bold in the themes and the events, is really that it's like big technology that's going to save us. It's like technological innovations, or really just like I've maintained the status quo. And it was so interesting. I just wanted to bring in something that I went to an event with an Indigenous speaker during the week, and she was saying about like, come to the Indigenous lands and see the solutions that big tech are bringing in, and that is your future. And it was so powerful, because she was basically making this point that because Indigenous people aren't valued, and because their rights to the land aren't valued, you have big tech companies or international companies testing out solutions that are actually so toxic to human health and are just prolonging our impact on the climate. And it's just so embodied, the fact that, here when we're talking about electric vehicles and all these things, and we're just really almost accelerating towards this point that we're just relying on more growth, more invention, more innovation, when really what we need to be doing is slowing down. And I think this is something that you've mentioned, and Kat's mentioned, Jack has mentioned, that really we need lifestyle change. We need to really think about like degrowth, slowing down. And that's something that the Indigenous Knowledges can bring in by pointing to the fact that technology is not going to save us, because the technologies that they're introducing are only more toxic, they're only worse for us. And, the solutions are there. We just need to be listening to the right people.
Yeah, and I think just picking up on that and linking it back to one of Kat's points about transparency, these are the people who are bringing the transparency. They actually have a vested interest in being as transparent and trying to make our world, the way our world operates currently, a transparent system. They're trying to sort of unfog the smokescreen that's been put up by a lot of the solutions that are being proposed by ministers and in some NDCs and whatnot. And that's another really important reason for having a great diversity of voices and greater inclusion at COP.
And sorry, just to add on to that as well, it's almost, it's a measure of transparency when you have people in the room who are saying things that are so directly opposed to the people that are controlling the conversation. If you have people saying that, the solutions you're proposing are making things worse and they're not right, that is, you have, that's the transparency that you're looking for.
Yeah.
And we just need more of it.
Definitely. And I think one thread to maybe pull out is, as we look towards COP27, there probably needs to be more space across the bilateral discussions throughout the year for Indigenous peoples, youth, and other really important stakeholders and people in these discussions to attend. And I think, Kat, that is something that you've really pulled out, is that we can't stop here. COP26 ended, but doesn't stop here. We need to carry on throughout the year.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just, again, doing these live discussions, talking about, the negotiations the day afterwards, let alone having not even been there. It's so, every day I ask our trackers, or I ask myself, okay, so what was missing? And every day they raise, like yesterday with transport, we were talking about how public transport was barely on the agenda. And instead it was all electrification and electric cars. And it's what's really like come through to me is how ridiculous it is, especially at this stage of the climate crisis, that we expect 2 weeks to be sufficient. And, the UK government has been making speeches about COP26 for some time. The UK government has positioned itself as relatively green compared to where it was in the past in terms of its political positioning of itself. And yet, the UK Prime Minister was only at COP for a handful of days. Governments have many duties to look at, but how can we put COP26 on a pedestal and then only spend one day talking about transport when, and Jack, you were talking yesterday about how military transport is this enormous issue, accounting for what sort of 6% of emissions or something along those lines. I won't misquote the number, but a huge contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. And it's barely given any airtime at all. Same with public transport, active transport. No discussions of active transport when that has to be such a core part of our behavioural change, would be such a positive thing for lifestyle change. and would obviously have those, reduced climate impacts associated with it. It's, I think, what's really come through to me, to summarize that rant, what's really come through to me is the fact that we've put COPs on a pedestal and we expect a lot from them, because that's sort of the way the UNFCCC presents it. That's the way the host governments present it, and that's the way it's treated. But, again, at this stage in the climate crisis, but it should have been the case for decades up to now, it's ridiculous to think that 2 weeks of discussions with a day or less on a topic would ever be sufficient to actually initiate the kind of dramatic transformations which we need. And we don't need them in 20, 30 years. We need them tomorrow. We need them today. So that's what's, as I say, that's what's really come through for me. And I feel also, to tie in our discussions on inclusion, if this were a more continuous dialogue, if this was a dialogue delegations didn't try to concentrate to COPs, that would also provide a mechanism by which to include the people that we need to hear, the Indigenous communities, the people on the front line, the women, the list goes on, the people who aren't currently in the conversation. So that's what's really, really come through to me. The fact that COP26 has been fascinating to look at, but what's really come through to me is how, just insufficient it is as a concept almost.
Hopefully over the next year, we can, as an organisation, we can facilitate some of that information getting out from the monthly meetings and bilateral negotiations, and provide greater access to some of these conversations that are happening. I guess to end on a more positive note, I think for today and our key takeaways, obviously we'll be doing post-analysis of all of the subjects that we've covered. I was hoping I could get maybe a positive end, and I think this might be on youth. I think we would all agree that youth has been somewhat more empowered this COP than previous COPs, and youth has had greater involvement in discussions. Maybe we all could give one sort of positive aspect to youth inclusion at COP. Obviously, Jack and Charlie, you have attended, which has been fantastic, and you've been able to share all your fantastic experiences with us. But maybe you could both start on something that you've taken away as youth members.
Do you want to start?
Yeah, well, I think for me, it's funny that even though we work in a youth-led NGO and our mission is amplifying youth voices, I think even myself turning up to this conference, it does feel like you're kind of an imposter, in the sense that it's what we say, and I do believe that youth do have the power to create change, but it's almost like I think you need to believe in yourself as well, that when you see all these older people going around in suits doing what they look like important things, that you do have a right to get involved, and taking what it's about, changing something that you really believe into something that you believe in yourself, that you can do it too. And I think I've just been so inspired by so many people that we've met here that are really just pushing the limits of what youth can do and youth involvement. That Phoebe from ClimaTalk being a keynote speaker. We've met people from the Youth Advisory Group who are really creating direct action. They're running events. They're speaking to the Secretary General of the UN. And I think I've been so inspired to really have the confidence in myself that I, as a young person, can also make an impact. And something that I do believe, but you need to internalize it, I think. And I think that has happened a lot for me here at COP.
Yeah, I think I'd second that. I think it's very powerful and empowering to see other young people here engaging with the process fully. And I guess that's a takeaway that I would like to say to everybody out there, all the climate talkers, that there are people here who are engaging power where it is and fighting for the change that needs to happen. And there's we all have to play a role in that, I guess. And we shouldn't be deterred by the fact that we feel like we're young people and we're not supposed to be in these spaces, or the fact that other people might have more knowledge on the climate crisis than us. Youth have really good ideas, not only energy, but the ideas, the actual positive solutions being put forth, which we've seen and spoken to young people on the ground here. It's something that everybody has to engage with. And I think from that perspective, it's really empowering. And there are so many people here who are doing that work, and we need everyone else to be on board, really.
Definitely, and I'll let you finish, Kat, but I guess my big thing builds on that, Jack, is that I've, from the other side, obviously being away from COP and doing the back end of your experience, we've seen it with climate change, climate talk. You know, people have really been engaging, and youth have been getting behind our work and wanting to hear more. And I think it's gaining momentum. I think more people are listening, and I think the youth are wanting to get involved and figure out how they can share their ideas or get involved in other people's ideas. So I think my biggest takeaway for like youth is like, you know, people are listening and people want to get involved, which is really, really fantastic to see.
Yeah, I very much, my points pretty much resonate with what all of you have just said. I find, I mean, the easiest way to feel a degree of hope about the climate crisis is to be involved with young activists, other activists from across the world. And that's really, like, since working more with ClimaTalk, I find even though I learn so much more about the climate crisis, I think so much more about the climate crisis, and that doesn't fill me with great joy. I have felt more personally motivated, because being surrounded by and knowing that across the world there are people far more active than myself, far more effective than myself, but nonetheless that there is a unity in that there are, you know, millions of young people, perhaps billions, pursuing the same goal. That does make me feel that even if in COP27 things aren't different, things will change, things are changing, and that is due to the amazing work of youth activists and indeed all activists on the climate across the world, certainly not just in the global north, but especially in the global south, where especially those on the front line are kind of seeing the effects of the climate crisis themselves, and yet having the kind of the strength to still fight the climate crisis. It's very inspiring to watch.
And I think on that note, we will. Oh, Charlie's got a last comment.
I just want to say, as the final thing, as this is our last live stream, I think Jack and I just wanted to say that we are so grateful to the work that you and Kat have done over the last few weeks. Your moderating of these live streams has been amazing. You're both unbelievably organized, and, you know, just staying calm through all our Wi-Fi and tech issues from this side, and it's just, and you've just made it so much easier for us, like, here, to be able to, like, get on with the work and tracking and knowing that we're in safe hands. And, you know, as well as you two, Felicity, Hannah, Alice, all our trackers, we're so grateful for the work that everyone has done to make these live streams as great as they have been. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Absolutely. I am so grateful for all the trackers. The insight that we have had in the last 2 weeks has been incredible. And I recommend everyone to keep an eye out for all our post-COP analysis, which I look forward to. Hopefully there'll be some developments and greater commitments as we move away from COP26 and towards COP27. And then a last push from us is to join us on the 7th of December for our post-COP evaluation event, which we look forward to bringing you more updates and insight into what happened at COP26. But yeah, thank you everyone for joining today, and thank you to Jack and Charlie for their attendance in a very dark room. We look forward to speaking to you both soon. Thanks everyone.